Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining me. We've pretty much got everybody registered now and attending who put their name down to. So I will make a start. I think we've got about enough to field a rugby team in the World Cup, which is pretty cool. Okay, so thanks for joining me, guys. What I'm going to do I put together an idea around a brief webinar to discuss with clients around sort of a subject that comes up a lot at the moment with our clients, and I thought I'd try and dispel some of the theories or the scaredness about what we can do and why we archive and aging and how we can use the WorkSpace Manager solution to get the best out of it. And so really it was a case of as the slide says, mastering workspace archiving and aging and archiving. I'm just going to sort of run through some experiences and some top tips and some ideas around what to think about when approaching this project. It's certainly not going to be a training session, but it would certainly help you understanding a bit more about what you may have to do internally in your own organizations. So just a bit of background just to remind you, DocAuto, founded in '97, are essentially a software development partner for the iManage, as it's now branded, work environment, but also moving very aggressively into the SharePoint world. And maybe I'll touch on that independently afterwards with clients, but we are having a lot of demand for our types of solutions in the SharePoint market, which is very exciting for us. Headquarters are in Atlanta and a UK office as well as a global partner network. The timeline itself of the product ranges, which you're all pretty much au fait with who are attending today's webinar, from '97 all the way up to today, if you like. The product range has grown pretty organically and in a good controlled manner. And the key product that we're going to be talking about is WorkSpace Manager here in the middle. And it's a bit of a sort of flagship product for DocAuto in terms of what it can do and how it really works well with your day-to-day management of your worksite environment. So we have a whole raft of solutions, and don't worry, I'm not going to go through these individually. It's just we're going to be really concentrating on using the WorkSpace Manager solution that you already have in play. Just a bit of background, though, around what else we do here. Obviously, we have the import-export solutions, which are very, very popular. And we have a lot of attraction around email management right now, around getting data from Exchange into WorkSite that hasn't necessarily been captured by the communication server, the EFS server, or services. And it's becoming very, very popular. And I think there'll be a webinar on that subject over the coming weeks around what we can do with it and what we've also done with it with clients. As well as that, monitoring and alerting, as ever, lots of clients we now see are very keen to identify activity and try and get some value out of the product range with monitoring and making sure it's the best it can be. And that's really by using our Helm solution and our Watchdog solution. Okay, so what are we going to discuss today? So what drives us to archive? Why do we do it? Using WorkSpace Manager to achieve your goal. Is there a standard approach? People ask me this a lot, actually, with the experience I've had using the product sets. And yeah, I'll cover that in terms of my experiences. And then also, finally, around the challenges you individually will face when actually approaching your own archiving solution or your archiving project. Sorry. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat window in your browser, and I'll see if I can get those answered during or at the end of the presentation. So, what drives us to archive? Well, there's 6 points here that I laid down on the slide. To kind of go through these. So when I ask clients, why do you want to archive, or why do you want to do this sort of project? It's the first thing I ask them is, why? What are you doing this for? And these are the sorts of answers I've had, and hopefully these will resonate in your own environment. Business requirements. Somebody has decided we need to do it for whatever reason. Storage issues. That's probably one of the most common reasons to start to archive. And storage issues is on the file store or the data storage, the database, or maybe the indexing environment, the storage within there. Legal requirements. Certainly in the UK, allegedly there is the law that after 7 years of a closed matter, I think it's 7 or 6, you have to essentially close this matter in a physical state, either discarding it or moving it somewhere else. And so that's a legal requirement, and so certainly WorkSpace Manager can assist there. Keeping the live database current. We all know that certain sort of departments within the organization really turn out matters and workspaces and document production, and you know, workspaces can become closed and then they become stagnant, and essentially they just sit there like a red book on a bookshelf, and it's never opened again potentially. And so really, certainly from a partner downwards sort of direction, we are seeing that people like the idea of keeping that current live database as current and as clean as possible. Speed issues. The more you put into the DMS, unless you manage it correctly, certainly on the searching and the backup side, you're going to see a performance sort of hit there. Yes, the database, your active database, can hold millions and millions of rows. I believe the recommendation is around 20 million rows in the certainly in the master table, I believe, but we've seen that grow exponentially above that. But really, from your end user standpoint, from searching, depending on how good they are at using the system, what we have found is that searching using full text searching, even if your indexer is up to date and really, really good, if people put large ambiguous searches into those profile forms, you know, the more data you have in that active database, the bigger the search will be and the longer it will take. And certainly now, with the growth of some firms, certainly with email management in there, people want to control that by separating out the archive stuff. And then finally, I had someone who said to me that, because that's what you do, you know, you archive, you close a matter and you archive. So, so yeah, that's why we want to archive stuff and move things around. So before just going further, let's just avoid the confusion here. So archiving essentially means to remove items from the system, those objects no longer in day-to-day use, and place them into long-term retrievable storage. And that is very, very different to a backup. Backup means to essentially take a copy of an object in the event of the original one being lost or damaged. And sometimes people kind of get a bit confused in that sort of crossover with what we're trying to achieve here. We're trying to archive items. We're trying to get them away from the production environment onto a secondary device database, and to make life a little bit easier and cleaner in your live environment. So you want to archive content. So here's an approach that I would kind of look to take on when looking at this project. The first thing really is set your requirements and talk to the business. We all know that the IT departments have a lot to do, and certainly there's a lot of pressures from the business. But when we're looking at archiving, without that discussion at the early stages with either a steering group or a committee, when you start to archive content, you may not have 100% sort of happy clients from your end users, because every person has a different idea and a different sort of thought process about what needs to be archived and when it should be archived and how it should be archived. So you really should start to set your requirements out and explain to the business what you can and cannot do. Typically, we would talk to the business and we would look to take direction from the billing system. And if the billing system has a matter that has been closed, we would then take that as our steer to do something with it. But we would then probably look to expand that physical move of the workspace to about maybe 30, 60, 90 days after that close date. And that's to allow for billings to complete, email management to complete, and so forth. And that generally works pretty well. Prepare the system. There's lots of moving parts within worksites, and when you're moving items within the worksite world, there's also even more moving parts. Build an archive database. Archiving needs to go somewhere. We generally recommend an archive database. So build that archive database and get that prepared. Prepare your idle environment, because the moment you start moving things into a new database, idle needs to know about it so that your end users will have minimal impact when searching and finding that data. Prepare the file store. The reason why is because the file store itself is going to receive the new documents via the archive database, and it needs to be ready for that and to either grow or at least be prepared for a like-for-like storage size from what you currently have. But certainly during your requirement stage, or maybe you're in an analysis stage of what you need to archive, you'll be pleasantly surprised maybe how much space that you are going to get back from your live file store. And obviously receive into your new file store. And just going back to why you archive, storage is a big challenge there, and it's becoming a challenge. And we did a project recently with a firm, and to back up the databases and the storage was taking potentially over 24 hours or something to completely back it up in a full backup, and they just couldn't cope with that backup window in terms of redeploying if a disaster recovery issue happened. So we looked at splitting things out and archiving. Register the iMan admin DLL on the local machine, and I'll come back to exactly what that means later on, but it's a key part to the successful moving of documents between worksite databases. And then build your jobs, test, and deploy. The testing I cannot sort of stress enough in terms of what the outcomes can be and the approach, and making sure you are happy with the jobs. So using WorkSpace Manager. WorkSpace Manager has many functionality parts to it. Creation of workspaces, publishing, deleting, updates, changes, all these different sort of day-to-day activities we do with this one product. But in there is archiving. Now archiving is actually referred in the product as aging. And if you look at your own product, you'll see aging in the product setup. So using the product, we're going to be looking at the aging options, and I'm going to go through some of these options shortly. And there's two parts. There's sort of aging options. There's also something called advanced aging options, and I'll dispel what the difference is there for you. To achieve that goal of archiving, we also need to look at the data, the input query. WorkSpace Manager will do exactly what you ask it to do. If you do not provide it with the relevant data to do something with, you won't have a successful project. And that's just not for archiving, that's also for creation of workspaces, updating, moving, deleting, and so forth. So the input query is pretty much key to the success of what you want to archive in your project. The aging conditions and the settings, and this is a section within the template tabs themselves around the options you take to successfully move the workspace and its content, and I will be showing this as well shortly. So is there a standard archive approach? The standard archive approach people would see is moving workspaces from one location to another using WorkSpace Manager or another tool. But the question always comes back to the business from my side is, how are we going to manage the unarchived challenge? And someone would say, well, what do you mean? And that is essentially when a matter is reopened. And you'd be surprised how many people say, oh, well, we don't reopen matters. And actually, when you do the analysis within firms, you'd be surprised that actually sometimes matters could reopen and close frequently within a really short period of time. So how do we manage that challenge? Do we move the entire workspace back to active? So when we move these workspaces from active to archive, we are picking up that workspace, all of its content, and we are essentially moving it into a completely new location and then bedding in those documents and then re-indexing them in that location. So the challenge there would be, if we unarchive it, we then got to do the whole reverse. Now we can do that. That is not a problem. Time is going to be the factor there. And sometimes when we unarchive items, or we reopen a matter, as the business would say, it's more often than not because an email has arrived out of the blue, or an unpaid invoice has been sent, even though the matter was closed maybe 12 months ago. And so more often than not, the data that needs to go back into that workspace that's being unarchived is really minimal. It's very rare that a whole workspace would need to be reopened in its full-fledged capability, because generally speaking, with our market space, when we close a matter, it's been closed for reasons. So something to think about there. Do we make the worksite database a read-write archive database? And to be honest, this has become quite a common methodology now by clients. They're moving data across to an archive database, but they're still leaving it read-write. And that's purely because they wanted to move the content to the archive location for speed issues on the production environment, storage issues, keeping the live data a bit cleaner. But they didn't necessarily want to cap what the users could do in the archive environment. However, to play devil's advocate, some businesses decide that when it goes to archive, it is locked down, read-only, and that is for a good reason, in the sense that you are time capturing a project or a matter file and to its open and then into its closed state. So again, some other things to maybe think about there. I have done a project in the past where they moved stuff to the archive environment, and using WorkSpace Manager, when the matter was reopened, what we did was we created a temporary workspace in the active database that had very similar folder structure to the original live workspace. It had search folders in the live data in the live workspace that were looking into the archived environment, and it allowed people to add documents as and when on that temporary workspace. But then when it was then closed, using the functionality in WorkSpace Manager, we then merged that workspace into the archived one. So this could happen all day, every day, and we'd constantly build these small temporary workspaces, and then they close them back down in the billing system. And then after that period of time, we then merge it into the original workspace in the archive environment. And that was a pretty popular approach that we did for a client there, and it works very, very well. And the key there is, for all of these, as I'll allude to later, is information, passage of information, making sure your business knows the rules and the methodology that has been applied. So, using WorkSpace options, WorkSpace Manager aging options, we can help define all these different ways and ideas to essentially achieve your goal of archiving. Okay, so for now, let's look at the product WorkSpace Manager, and we'll run through some of the options we have in the solution to make, hopefully, your life a little bit easier when looking at archiving. So, I have a version 9 client here, Desk Site 9 and File Site 9, and a couple of databases, and I have WorkSpace Manager loaded up in front of me. Now, I would always recommend, when doing archiving or aging as a project, you get the latest version available downloaded onto your system, and that's really from personal experience, is because we've done a lot of work around archiving and aging in the last probably 12 months, and there's some new functions and features in there that are really important for you to take advantage of. So hopefully a lot of you on this call have already used WorkSpace Manager, and you're not now looking at a total alien screen where you're not sure what we're looking at here. So WorkSpace Manager, I've got a job set up here to archive a workspace, and really just I wanted to go through some of the options and features that hopefully should be pretty good for you. So what we're looking at now is my input query. Okay, now as I said earlier, the input query is designed to define what we want to archive. And I've just got a really simple query that says select top 1 stuff from my matters table where client number is 1078. And if I look now, this is the workspace that I want to do something with. And that is a key sort of top tip to making a successful sort of project start, is define what you want to move from the early stages of your input query. So all I'm going to be looking for is this one workspace, and that's the only workspace I want to do anything with right now. So if I just go up to my job properties within the job, what we need to do first of all is enable a registry key, supervise import registry key, and that will allow us to successfully move the document into your new library and start the process of maintaining that document number, which I'll come on to shortly. So we have a number of different options in the properties here, but down on the right hand side here is something called the advanced aging options. Now this is broken into a number of different sections. Now I'm not going to go through everything in lots of detail, But really, what we can do within this section is run an element of essentially sort of pre-flight checks in terms of the documents that we're going to be moving across by doing some profile metadata checks, making sure that the documents match on the values that we've assigned to the job itself. And then we have something that's pretty important called the advanced aging options. And this is a section that's fairly new in the certainly the last 12 months or so, is the ability to now preserve documents when copying. Now, one of the challenges we found years ago was people did not want to move anything or archive anything simply because they did not want to lose that document number. We can now maintain that document number for you as you age and archive those documents around the system. The trick to that, as I said to you earlier, is making sure the I'm an Admin DLL is registered correctly with on the server that you're running the product through, and that will ensure that the document number can be maintained correctly. So we can preserve the document number when copying, and if you're doing maybe a multiple archive sort of job where you're maybe moving workspaces from lots of different libraries into one consolidated archive environment, we can add source numbers to different workspaces depending on where they're coming from. If the number already exists, we can skip it, save it as the next number, which is what I probably recommend, save as a new version. We can delete all the other versions and recopy, which is well, it's there as an option if you really wanted to do it. Now, when we do this, we obviously want to tell the index that we're ready to sort of let you know there's new content. And what we can do here is we can just update the relevant fields here with the edit date ranges, just to make sure that the idle engine kicks into life and sees that there's new data applied in the idle archive content engine. Metadata management, more often than not, we're archiving stuff that could be quite old, so we can enable any disabled values that have been done there. I'll give you an example. I've done a project where we have archived away every personal workspace from a user that has left the firm, and more often than not, those users have been disabled. So to do this, we would need to identify the users using a query, and obviously if they've been disabled, we want to re-enable them at this stage here as well, which is pretty good. And we can also add the values into the target database if you so wish. So those are some of the options sort of thus far, if you like. We can also do, we can disable these values once they've been archived, so you can essentially disable them afterwards as well, which is pretty good. Yeah, so those are some of the options there, and I'll come back to that as we go through. So we have our query here, and we would then want to identify the template or the options within the product that we're going to take. Now, we're not going to do any translation. We're going to straight into our template tab. Now, if I go to the template options here, when we do any archiving, we will always need to have this option here selected, which is the ability to create new workspaces, because we are basically building a new workspace in the archive database. Lookup table maintenance, if you wanted to add the values into the target database, the archive database on the fly, we would use these functions to ensure that we can add those values in there. We always look for existing workspaces by custom 1 and custom 2. In my example, maybe differently in your example. And then under the updating section here, the key thing we want to look at is we need to allow workspace aging, and this section here would apply it. And that's all you would need really in a real basic sort of archive environment in terms of those setup of those options there. Just going back into some further options, we have what we call global options that really are only set once in the entire setup and then sort of forgotten about. If you didn't really care about maintaining document numbers, what you can also do is you can apply the content of the document information into a spare custom value. I've often appended stuff to the comments field in the document profile, which is pretty nice, and people like that kind of thing when we're moving stuff around. So there's lots of options in here. And when we are copying content, we want to check for existing structures, or we could create a brand new one each time. If you're going to go down the road of merging workspaces, I would look to have this option here selected, which is check for existing structures. And that would basically take the workspace we're trying to archive or merge. It would look at the metadata structure. It would try and match on it in the target location. If it finds it, it will just merge the content into that location for you. We have processing options where we can unlock, for example, documents that have been locked down, so that we can relock them afterwards. We can copy related information if you wanted to. If you find that people are relating documents, we can copy those relations over as well. Then we have a number of processing options where we can start to investigate what we do around shortcuts and so forth. And there's always an option here that I like to select called Create Migrated History Event. What that allows us to do is essentially put a history event on the documents to say, yeah, we've migrated it. So as soon as someone looks at that document in the archive location, they can at least see on the history that something happened to it in a mechanical way using WorkSpace Manager potentially. So then we look at the actual properties themselves in the workspace. Now, if you notice on my template here, I don't have any folders. All I've got is Archive Me. I don't care about anything else because all I'm doing is looking for the workspaces by the client and the matter number. And the client node code we're using is 1078. So when I look at the template itself, I know the workspace currently lives in the active database, but I'm looking for the workspace by the client and matter number, which is taken from my input query. We then have to identify a user using our publishing option here who is essentially going to be doing that process. And I'm using administrator, like an NRT admin user. And we've allowed the aging function there to proceed with this sort of process. And then really once we've done that, the aging tab sort of comes alive. And this is where we can set our condition. Now I've made my job a very straightforward job, and I'm using a really simple query that will allow me to target the workspaces. So if the workspace matches the value set in the condition, it will then archive or age. You don't just have to use a query. You could have a very generic input query, and you can define anything you wanted within there. So you could be looking at maybe all the different workspaces from a certain department or from a certain partner, and then we can use simple lookup values to identify custom 3 as partner. Anything with a certain partner set against it, it will then use that as its criteria or its condition to then go in and actually do some archiving or aging. And then the operations set, and this is the real kind of the crux of this job, the operations that we're going to proceed with. So copying the content. So we're going to copy the workspace to the archive database, as I've identified there. Okay. The product itself will archive, but if you wanted to, we could just make a copy. I've done many projects where we have aged a workspace around the world to suit local environments. For example, I've copied precedent libraries from a London location to Singapore, and I've used WorkSpace Manager to every night pick up new data and move it to that location so that the users in Singapore can see the content locally in their Singapore database, and they don't have to connect back to London each time. And we use this exact functionality to do this. We can copy the structures, we can copy searches, copy metadata and security parts to the workspace, copy the content. We can then refile the content afterwards as well if you want, and recreate the history. Now, the more options we have set here, the longer the job takes to complete because of the actions it's doing each time, document by document. Copy foreign content search and copy native search. So just a top tip around these here, when we're copying search results, we want to make sure when we are copying search results themselves that the searches are correctly defined and are very, or potentially tied down to maybe the workspace you're working on. The reason why is because if you have a search in a workspace that has something like recent documents, last 5 days, unless it's tied down to the client and matter that we're archiving, it would activate that search and potentially move across all the documents that are retrieved from those searches. And I've seen that certainly within personal workspaces, that people have built their own searches that are show me all documents that I've ever built in the last year. And then we've moved the content over to the archive database. And then when we come up to our deletion part, which is essentially the clean down, we've then deleted the content from the original location and potentially deleted and cleaned down documents that shouldn't have been deleted because the search results that we used when executing and then copying across were very ambiguous and the content was all over the place, and then we had some interesting challenges to try and work with the client to get that stuff all back. So very, very dangerous sort of section here. You need to really think about that search content area. But very, very powerful and pretty handy when used in the right way. If you wanted to do, which we have done in the past, we can also do filtering. So maybe you want to archive, but you only want to take the latest version. Maybe you're archiving to a location or copying to a location, and the business doesn't care about all the other versions. They only want to archive and store the final version of each document. And this is what we can do. We can filter out the stuff that we do or don't want to move and archive and copy when we are moving stuff. So lots and lots of options in there. If I just look at my query now, 1078, I think I had it in my list I was working on earlier. I think 1078.1 is there, and there's some documents in here. I think, oh, there we go. And so 1078 is our workspace. If I just come down to my archive database here, we've got some workspaces already in there. But if I now run the job, run through it goes through all the settings. And if I just pause the job for us, just to show you a few things here, you can see if I pause the job that it's running through the settings, and now it's looking to identify the workspace, and now as it's building the workspace, it's actually looking to add the content and the workspace metadata into the target library. It's copying the content across, and all being well, it will then delete that workspace. So if I just refresh here, there's our 1078 workspace, and we've got the my workspace is moved over, and okay, in true fashion, the content didn't come with it, and I think I know the reason why, but we'll come back to that. And if I look at the log now, what we can see from the log, it identifies the workspace by its query. So we have our query set here. It goes off and looks for the workspace by client and matter, and it then runs through the settings using the aging functionality that's been defined in the job. And using the verifications, it's building the metadata values into the target database, which is pretty nice functionality, and goes through the whole structure, building the structure and so forth. And then as I scroll down, it's looking to build the content into the workspace as well. And the reason why it hasn't is the file name extension is too long in the document that I have copied. And this is actually a common error that I've seen when moving content around. When we move stuff between databases, we're actually limited by what Windows will provide us with its 252 character set. So we need to be aware of that when moving content. And if required, you could run a scan of that before you did a job itself. But that's the reason why my documents didn't copy. So I've managed to dig myself out pretty nicely there, thankfully. Okay, so lots of options to think about there. Then